The rudder angle indicator froze at 10 degrees starboard just as the current caught the heavy bow of the ship. We were on board the Iron Lady, a Panamax bulk carrier loaded with 60,000 tons of grain. We were making our approach into the Columbia River. It is a tricky entrance. The sandbars shift and the currents run fast. We had just crossed the bar, which is the point where the river meets the ocean swells. The water was gray and choppy. The wind was blowing 20 knots from the northwest. It was a typical afternoon in late November. The ship was heavy. You could feel the weight of the cargo in how she moved through the water. She was sluggish but steady. On the bridge, the atmosphere was quiet. Captain Miller stood by the radar on the port side. He was a man in his 60s who had spent 40 years at sea. He never raised his voice. The pilot was standing center, watching the visual markers on the shore. The third officer was at the chart table, marking our position every 3 minutes. I was the chief mate, standing near the telegraph, ready to handle communications. The helmsman was a young, able seaman named Davies. He was focused on the compass and the rudder angle indicator. The engine was running at slow ahead. We needed enough speed to maintain steerage against the current, but not so much that we would lose control if things got tight. The channel here is not wide. On the starboard side, there are shallow sandbanks. On the port side, there is the main navigation channel, but usually there is oncoming traffic. We had tested the steering gear 1 hour before arrival. The checklist was complete. Both hydraulic pumps were running. The system showed green lights. We had no reason to suspect any trouble. The pilot ordered a course adjustment to starboard to account for the set of the current. Davies turned the wheel. The ship began to swing slowly to the right. The trouble started silently. The pilot watched the bow swing past the heading he wanted. "Midships," the pilot said. "Midships, sir," Davies repeated. He turned the wheel back to the center position. I was looking out the forward window. The bow continued to swing to the right. It was moving slowly, but it was definitely not stopping. The heading monitor showed the numbers climbing. "Counter rudder," the pilot said. "Port 10. "Port 10, sir," Davies said. He spun the wheel to the left. We all waited for the ship to check its swing. A loaded bulk carrier does not stop turning instantly. It takes a moment for the water to hit the rudder and push the stern, but the swing did not slow down. It actually seemed to speed up as the current grabbed us. Davies looked down at the panel. His face went pale. "She's not answering, sir." "What?" Captain Miller turned from the radar. "Rudder is stuck, sir," Davies said. "Indicator reads starboard 10. I have the wheel at port 20 now. No movement." Captain Miller stepped to the center console. Looked at the rudder angle indicator. It was frozen. The red needle sat perfectly still at 10 degrees to the right. The ship was still turning toward the sandbank. "Switch to non-follow-up," Miller ordered. Davies flipped the switch on the side of the stand. This mode bypasses the electronic wheel and uses a direct lever to control the solenoids. He pushed the lever to the left. We watched the needle. It did not move. "No response, sir," Davies said. The bridge alarm system suddenly activated. A loud buzzer filled the room. The panel lit up with a red light. "Steering gear fail." "Silence that alarm," Miller said calmly. The third officer pressed the button. The room went quiet, but the tension was thick. The ship was now 15 degrees off course and heading for the edge of the channel. "Captain, we are swinging toward the shoal," the pilot said. "We are 2 cables from the 10-meter line. If we ground here with this tide, we will stick hard." "I know," Miller said. He picked up the phone to the engine control room. "Chief, we have lost steering. The rudder is stuck at starboard 10. We need immediate power." I could hear the chief engineer's voice on the other end, though I couldn't make out the words. Miller listened for a second. "Get it back," Miller said. "We are drifting toward the bank." He hung up. "Mate," he said to me, "go to the steering gear room. Take a radio. Tell me exactly what is happening. We need that rudder moving now." "Yes, sir," I said. I grabbed the UHF radio and ran out of the bridge wing door. I went down the external stairs to the main deck. The wind hit me hard. I could see the water churning along the side of the hull. The angle of the ship was obvious now. We were crabbing sideways. The bow was pointing toward the visible line of breaking water where the sandbar started. I ran along the main deck. It is a long run on a bulk carrier, nearly 200 meters from the accommodation block to the stern if you go the long way, but I took the internal alleyway to get to the steering flat hatch. My boots hammered on the steel deck. I could feel the vibration of the main engine. It was still turning. If we stopped the engine, we would lose all control and the current would just sweep us onto the rocks. We had to keep moving, even if we were moving in the wrong direction. I reached the steering gear room door. It is a heavy steel watertight door. I undid the clips and swung it open. The noise inside was deafening. The steering gear room houses the massive hydraulic rams that turn the rudder stock. It usually smells of hydraulic oil and grease. Inside, I saw the second engineer. He was already there. He was climbing over the piping near the number 1 pump unit. "What's the situation?" I shouted over the noise of the machinery. The second engineer pointed at the pressure gauge on the number 1 unit. The needle was at 0. There was hydraulic fluid sprayed across the deck plates. It was slick and dangerous. "Blown seal on the main discharge line," he shouted. It dumped the oil. The low-level switch tripped the pump. "What about number 2? I asked. "Ships always have 2 pumps for redundancy." "We tried to auto-switch," he said, "but the system logic locked out because of the oil level alarm. It thinks the whole tank is empty." I keyed my radio. "Bridge, this is the mate." "Go ahead, mate." Captain Miller's voice came through the speaker. "Number 1 pump has blown a seal. Massive leak. The system has locked out both pumps due to a low oil level sensor error. We have no hydraulic pressure." There was a pause on the radio. The ship groaned as it rolled slightly in the swell. I knew that every second we wasted, the Iron Lady was moving closer to the mud. "Mate," Miller said, "can you override it?" "We are trying now," I said. The second engineer was already at the electrical cabinet. He was trying to bypass the safety lockout, but the steering gear is a complex system. The hydraulic rams were locked in position by the hydraulic lock. Until we could get pressure to the other side of the piston, that rudder would not move. It was acting like a fixed fin, holding us in a permanent turn. I looked at the rudder stock. It was a massive steel column painted gray. It was turned slightly. It looked solid, immovable. "Bridge," I said, "we need minutes. We have to isolate the leak and force the second pump to start." "You don't have minutes," the pilot's voice cut in on the radio. "We are 1 cable from the shallows. The current is pushing us hard. We need rudder now, or we need to drop the anchors." Dropping anchors at this speed with a loaded ship and a strong current was dangerous. It could rip the windlass right off the deck, but hitting the sandbar would tear the bottom open. "Work faster," I told the second engineer. He wiped oil from his face. "I'm bypassing the solenoid," he said. "Get ready to open the number 2 isolation valve manually." I moved to the large red valve wheel on the number 2 unit. My hands were slippery with the oil mist in the air. I gripped the cold steel of the wheel. "Standing by," I said. The ship vibrated again, a lower shuddering feeling. We were getting into shallower water. The hydrodynamic interaction was starting to shake the hull. We were running out of deep water. Inside the steering flat, the noise was terrible. The second engineer used a screwdriver to force the electrical contactor switch in the main cabinet. Sparks flew, but the connection held. I turned the heavy manual isolation valve on the number 2 unit. It was stiff. I used both hands, straining against the cold metal wheel. "Pump starting," the engineer yelled. The electric motor whined. It spun up to speed. I watched the pressure gauge on the bulkhead. The needle bounced, then climbed to 100 bar. "Bridge, we have pressure on number 2, I shouted into the radio. "Move it to midships," Captain Miller replied immediately. "Now." The second engineer ran to the hydraulic valve block. He pushed the manual solenoid override pin. He used a wrench to depress the steel pin because the electronic signal was still locked out. The huge hydraulic rams groaned. The pistons began to retract slowly. The rudder stock turned. It was fighting the massive water pressure against the rudder blade. "It is moving," I said, "passing 5 degrees starboard. Midships now." "Hold it there," Miller said. "Holding midships," I confirmed. But the ship was heavy. The momentum of the turn was already established. Even with the rudder straight, the Iron Lady was sliding sideways toward the bank. The vibration from the propeller increased as the water depth decreased under our keel. We were no longer turning right, but we were not turning left either. We were just drifting diagonally toward the sand. "She is not checking the swing." The pilot's voice came over the radio. It was flat and serious. "We are still sliding toward the 10-meter line. The current is pushing the stern in. I need hard port immediately." "Give me hard port," Miller ordered. "Engineer, push for port side," I yelled. The second engineer adjusted his grip on the valve block. He was standing in a pool of hydraulic oil from the first leak. It was spreading across the deck plates with the rolling of the ship. He pushed the other pin on the block to direct the flow to the port cylinders. The rams pushed. The rudder stock turned to the left. 5 degrees port, 10 degrees port. Then a sharp cracking sound echoed through the room. "Pressure dropping," the engineer shouted. I looked at the gauge. It fell from 100 bar to 40. The rudder stopped moving at 10 degrees port. The cross-connection pipe between the two systems was vibrating violently. The leak on number 1 was affecting number 2 because the return line was shared. The oil level in the main tank was critical. The pump was sucking air. "We are losing pressure," I reported. "Rudder stuck at port 10. We can't get more angle." "It is not enough," the pilot said. "Well, we are drifting onto the sands. Distance 1 cable." On the bridge, Captain Miller made a decision. He could not wait for us to fix the hydraulics. The ship was seconds away from grounding. "Bosun, stand by the port anchor," Miller ordered on the deck frequency. "Standing by, Captain," the bosun replied from the bow. "We are going to dredge it," Miller said. "Prepare to let go on the brake." Dredging an anchor means dropping it while the ship is moving. It is extremely risky. If the chain catches on a rock, it can tear the windlass apart or rip a hole in the bow. If you drop too much chain, the ship swings too fast and hits the bank stern first. "Engine stop," Miller ordered. "Full astern." The ship shuddered violently. The engine room reversed the massive propeller. The wash hit the hull. The vibration shook the tools off the shelves in the steering gear room. I had to grab a pipe to stay standing. The second engineer slipped on the oil but scrambled back up, keeping his hand on the valve pin. "Drop the port anchor," Miller ordered. "1 shackle only. Hold the brake." We heard the roar of the chain all the way at the stern. It sounded like thunder running through the steel of the ship. On the bow, the bosun opened the brake. The heavy anchor splashed into the gray water. The chain flew out, rust dust flying in a cloud. The bosun tightened the brake hard when the first painted mark appeared. The chain went tight. It groaned under the strain of 60,000 tons of ship moving at 4 knots. "Holding!" the bosun yelled. The anchor dug into the river mud. It acted like a pivot point. The bow was suddenly pulled to the left. This was the intention, to swing the nose away from the danger, but the stern was still swinging toward the shallow water due to the rotation. "Mate," Miller called me, "rudder is still at port 10. We need hard port to clear the stern. The prop walk from backing down is pushing the stern toward the bank. We need the rudder to counteract it. We need it now." "We don't have the pressure," I yelled back. "Bypass the return filter," the second engineer shouted at me. "It's clogged with debris from the seal failure. That's why we have back pressure." It was a desperate guess. The filter unit was a large metal canister near the tank. If I opened the bypass valve, we would send dirty oil into the pump, potentially destroying it, but we needed pressure for maybe 30 seconds. "Do it!" I yelled. I scrambled over the slippery deck to the filter bypass valve. It was painted yellow. I grabbed the wheel. It was stuck. I kicked it with my steel-toed boot. It jarred loose. I spun it open. Immediately, the sound of the pump changed. It went from a high whine to a lower, grinding growl. It was sucking in everything. But the pressure gauge on the wall slammed back up to 100 bar. "Pressure is up," I shouted. "Hard port now." The second engineer jammed the valve pin down with his wrench. The rams jumped. The rudder stock swung heavily. 15 degrees, 20, 30, hard port. "Rudder is hard port," I screamed into the radio. "Engine full ahead," the pilot ordered instantly. This was the critical maneuver. The anchor was dragging the bow left. The engine kicked forward, shooting water fast over the hard-turned rudder. This generates lift, shoving the stern away from the bank. The ship groaned. The metal frames creaked loud enough to hear over the engine. The hull vibrated. We were fighting the current, the momentum, and the mud. "Stern is clearing," the pilot said. 10 meters off the bank, 5 meters. In the steering room, we watched the stock. It held steady. The pump was making a terrible grinding noise as it ate the metal shavings from the failed seal, but it held the pressure. "Keep it there," Miller said. "Don't let it slip." The second engineer was shaking. His arms were locked on the valve block. I stood ready at the isolation valve in case the pipe burst. We waited. The seconds stretched out. We could feel the ship rolling, fighting to turn back into the channel. The vibration of the hull changed tone as the propeller bit into the water. With the rudder stuck hard over to the left and the engine surging forward, the stern of the Iron Lady began to swing away from the sandbank. It was a slow movement at first. The mud was close enough that the water coming off the propeller was turning brown, churning up the silt from the river bottom. "Stern is clearing," the pilot said on the radio. "We have 20 meters now. Keep the power on." In the steering gear room, the noise was incredible. The hydraulic pump was screaming. It was a mechanical screech, metal grinding on metal, because the oil was dirty and the bearings were failing. The second engineer kept his weight on the valve pin, forcing the fluid into the rams. Sweat was dripping off his nose onto the oily deck plates. "Hold it," I told him. "Don't let go." We felt the ship heel over as she turned sharply back toward the center of the channel. We were moving away from the danger zone, but now we had a new problem. We were turning too fast toward the oncoming traffic lane. "Midships," the pilot ordered. "Midships now," I shouted to the engineer. The second engineer released the pressure on the port valve pin. He grabbed the opposing pin for the starboard movement. He had to manually feather the valve, tapping it with the wrench to bleed the pressure off so the rudder would slide back to the center. "Coming to midships," I reported. I watched the mechanical angle indicator on the rudder stock. It moved jerkily, 20 degrees left, 10 degrees, 0. "Rudder is midships," I said. "Steer course 105, the pilot said. "We need to get to the Astoria anchorage. We cannot navigate the whole river like this." "Understood," Captain Miller replied. "Mate, you are now the steering gear. Listen to my commands. You have to operate the valves manually to hold the course." "Copy that, Captain," I said. This is physically difficult work. Usually an autopilot or a helmsman makes tiny adjustments constantly. Now we had to do it by hand down in the loud, hot steering flat. "Starboard 5, Miller ordered. "Starboard 5, I repeated to the engineer. He pressed the right side pin. The rams pushed. The indicator moved. "Check," I shouted. He let go. The rudder stopped at 5 degrees. For the next hour, this was our world. The ship moved up the river channel. The current was still strong, pushing us around, so we had to be fast. The heat in the room rose because the hydraulic oil was overheating. The cooling system couldn't handle the friction from the damaged pump. The air filled with a thick burning smell, hot oil and scorched metal. The chief engineer arrived 10 minutes later with the electrical officer. They didn't interfere. They saw what we were doing and let us work. The chief monitored the temperature of the pump motor. "It's running at 90 degrees Celsius, the chief said loudly. "It's going to seize eventually." "How far to the anchorage?" I keyed the radio. "Bridge, engine room. Pump is overheating. How long until we anchor?" 20 minutes, Miller replied. "We are just coming up on the bridge. We passed under the Astoria-Megler Bridge. I couldn't see it, but I could feel the shadow and the change in the radar patterns that the captain mentioned on the radio. The river widened here. Port 10, came the order. We were starting the turn into the anchorage area. The second engineer was exhausted. His hands were cramping from gripping the small steel pins and the wrench. I stepped in and took over the valve block for a few minutes to give him a break. The vibration was numbing. You could feel the fluid rushing through the pipes under high pressure. "Steady on heading," Miller said. "Dead slow ahead." The ship slowed down. The noise of the main engine dropped away, leaving only the screaming of the steering pump. "Stop engine," Miller ordered. The vibration ceased. We were drifting into the parking spot. "Finished with steering," Miller said. "Drop the starboard anchor. 3 shackles in the water." I heard the brake release on the bow. The chain roared again, a familiar and welcome sound. The Iron Lady drifted back until the chain pulled tight. "Anchor's holding," the bosun reported. "That'll do," Miller said. "Secure the main engine. Shut down the steering gear." I looked at the second engineer. "Kill it," I said. He hit the emergency stop button on the electrical panel. The screaming pump spun down and went silent. The sudden quiet was heavy. My ears were ringing. The steering gear room was hot, smelling of burnt oil, and the deck was slippery with the leaked fluid. We stood there for a moment, breathing hard. The rudder was still, locked by the hydraulic lock valves. We were safe. Half an hour later, I went up to the bridge. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, visible through the mouth of the river. The sky was a dull purple and the water was black. The ship was riding quietly at anchor. Captain Miller was sitting in his chair, writing in the official logbook. He looked up when I entered. He looked the same as always. Calm, maybe a little more tired around the eyes. "Good work, mate," he said. "How close was it?" I asked. "The stern cleared the 10-meter line by about 15 meters, he said. He tapped the chart. "If the anchor hadn't grabbed the buoy when it did, or if you hadn't bypassed that filter, we would be stuck on Desdemona Sands right now. We would have broken the rudder off." I nodded. I went to the chart table and looked at the penciled lines. You could see the sharp zigzag where we dredged the anchor and forced the turn. It looked like a mistake on the paper, but it was the only reason we were floating. The chief engineer came up a few minutes later. He had a rag in his hand, wiping grease from his fingers. "Number 1 pump is scrap," he reported plainly. "The shaft is scored, seals are gone, the casing is cracked from the heat. Number 2 is damaged from the debris, but we can rebuild it. We have the spares. We'll need a tug to get to the Portland berth, though. We can't steer under our own power safely." "I'll call the agent in the Coast Guard," Miller said. "We aren't going anywhere tonight." I walked out to the bridge wing. The wind had died down. The lights of Astoria were twinkling on the shore. I looked down at the foredeck. The crew was already washing down the anchor chain, spraying off the river mud. It was just work. There was no celebration. We didn't talk about how scared we were. We didn't discuss what would have happened if the ship had grounded and cracked the hull. We just followed the procedure. The ship was safe, the cargo was dry, and nobody was hurt. I went back inside to fill out the deck log. I picked up the black pen and wrote the entry in clear block letters, 1830. Vessel anchored at Astoria Anchorage. Port and starboard steering pumps shut down for repairs. All systems secure. I closed the book. My shift was over. I went down to the mess room to get some coffee.